The image we have today of demonic creatures as agents of chaos, dedicated to subverting order and diverting humanity from its path, has not always been so clear-cut. This conception, so prevalent in contemporary religions, has been slowly carved out over the centuries. In the early days of the Israelite tradition, for example, evil was not personified in a single absolute figure, but dispersed in more subtle forms, almost always linked to ancestral fears of everyday life. The early Hebrews lived with a reality where threats seemed to come from the surrounding environment, from the scorching heat that made the land barren, from the dry winds that carried disease, or from the silent nights where anything seemed possible. The invisible forces that haunted this world were not seen only as enemies of the divine, but as manifestations of the very unstable balance between life and death. The shadows were not divided between heroes and villains. They belonged to a much more nebulous realm. While the Egyptians and Mesopotamians detailed their spirits with names, functions, and attributes, the Israelites followed a curious path. They chose silence, or at least a disconcerting discretion. It is not that they ignored the existence of these entities. There are mentions, albeit sparse, of spiritual beings that caused torment, disturbed kings, or appeared to punish, but instead of naming them and organizing them into hierarchies as their neighbors did, they preferred to keep these figures on a more vague and ambiguous plane. It is possible that this choice was linked to an attempt to maintain a distinct religious identity. By avoiding completely integrating elements from surrounding cultures, they preserved a monotheism that was still in the making, which needed to avoid the fragmentation that these figures could suggest. Still, the texts give away some clues. Some of these entities seem to act on the orders of the Creator himself, which raises another question. Were they divine emissaries or echoes of an older belief, still alive between the lines? Unlike the later Christian tradition, where the devil is understood as an autonomous and rebellious force, in ancient Israelite thought, these figures seemed to depend on the supreme will. They were sometimes instruments of punishment, messengers of trials, or symbolic expressions of aspects of the divine itself. This idea of an evil separate from God would only become established centuries later in an effort to organize the spiritual world into clear lines of good versus evil. Egypt presented beasts with hybrid bodies and specific functions in the judgment of souls. In Mesopotamia, rituals protected homes against spirits wandering in search of rest. And the Israelites, despite living surrounded by these influences, they maintained their own parameters. A careful reading of the writings shows that these elements were absorbed with caution, without ever completely dominating the religious structure. In more enigmatic passages, there are mentions of desolate places, spirits associated with the desert, and beings that inhabit arid and remote regions. They are not always called demons, but they perform similar functions. The feeling is that we are dealing with fragments of ancient beliefs that have survived in the written tradition in a camouflaged form. Each time these records are examined with attentive eyes, a new layer is revealed. Behind the apparent simplicity of the scriptures lies a rich symbolic world where nothing is said by chance. And perhaps among these layers lies a truth that has long escaped traditional understanding, a forgotten view of the boundaries between the sacred and the feared. Studying these ancient beliefs does not merely reveal forgotten curiosities. It opens up the profound transformations that shaped entire religions, many of which still influence thoughts and behaviors in the world today. Behind the fragments preserved in ancient writings, a gradual process of theological construction emerges, where the concept of invisible forces was adjusted, filtered, and reinterpreted until it became what we know today as the demonic imagination. For the early Israelites, the silence of the desert had a specific weight. It was not a comfortable emptiness, but rather a threatening absence, when not even the wind stirred, when no animal interrupted the stillness with its natural sounds. It was interpreted as a warning. Those arid and isolated regions were, for many, domains of hidden presences, beings that could not be seen, but neither could they be ignored. Interestingly, these beings were not represented with the clarity with which we know them today. They were not demons, as portrayed by later religious traditions. There was a layer of ambiguity in their descriptions. They were manifestations of the unknown, symbolic expressions of forces that escaped human understanding. Unlike civilizations, such as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian, whose records contain detailed lists of evil spirits, the Israelites maintained a curious distance from such practices. While the Mesopotamians feared and invoked Pazuzu to protect themselves from pests, and the Egyptians feared the judgment of Amit, a creature that devoured impure hearts, the Israelites seemed hesitant to structure a demonological hierarchy. Instead, some hostile figures appeared subordinate to divine will. One of the most emblematic examples is the episode involving King Saul. According to the book of Samuel, a disturbing spirit tormented him, not as punishment from a rebellious entity, but as a present sent by God himself. There was no direct opposition to the supreme deity, but rather the use of spiritual agents as tools to correct, punish, or teach. This view diluted the idea of an evil with a will of its own. Between the 12th and 7th centuries BC, the Israelites still lived in tribal structures, constantly interacting with neighboring peoples. In this scenario, beliefs mixed easily. It is likely that some figures present in Hebrew texts were influenced by Canaanite deities or Mesopotamian spirits. A good example of this is the mention of the Shedim in Deuteronomy, obscure entities to whom sacrifices were offered. The similarity to the Shedu of the Mesopotamian tradition is clear, albeit reinterpreted according to Israelite values. Another figure shrouded in mystery is Azazel. In Leviticus, an expiatory ritual involves the choice of a goat that is sent into the desert, symbolically carrying the sins of the people. Its destination, Azazel. Over time, he came to be identified as a demonic entity. However, in the oldest forms of the text, his role and very existence remain ambiguous. It is unclear whether he was an evil spirit, a place, or a personification of the removal of the sacred. These elements, however discreet they may seem, reveal a lot about how the ancient Israelites understood the supernatural. Before contact. With cultures such as the Persian, there was no established place for celestial rebels, but everything changed after the Babylonian exile. The encounter with Zoroastrianism introduced concepts that would mark Western spirituality forever. The eternal battle between light and darkness, absolute good against pure evil. It was in this new scenario that texts such as the Book of Enoch emerged, where fallen angels come to occupy a prominent place. They are beings who defied the heavenly order and were therefore cast into deep abysses. In this reinterpretation, the Nephilim, formerly mysterious giants, became forbidden offspring, the fruit of a cosmic transgression. Gradually, evil took on more organized and, above all, autonomous forms. For centuries, evil had been treated as a consequence of disorder or as part of divine justice. Now it was gaining a face, an intention, an agenda. The shadow now had a name, and with it, a new theology took shape, one that would divide the cosmos into opposing camps and set the stage for a new spiritual paradigm. The Israelites of the early ages did not understand the universe as a battlefield between absolute good and evil incarnate. Their worldview revolved around the balance between the established order and the forces that threatened to disrupt it. Chaos, for them, was an element present in creation, something that God controlled, not a rival with a will of its own. Betsy, their earliest texts, there is no direct opposition between God and an evil figure. All forces, even the most severe, were under the authority of the Creator. This conception appears clearly in the book of Job. There, the suffering that befalls the protagonist is not caused by a rebellious being acting on its own, but by a member of the heavenly court. Called the adversary, this character operates with divine permission, putting Job to the test without ever directly challenging the Lord. He acts as part of the plan, not as an external enemy. This logic shows that, at that time, the idea of evil was understood as an integral part of the divine system itself, a tool for testing, disciplining, or correcting. But this understanding began to change over time. As the Hebrew people were confronted with new cultures and ideas, their beliefs were shaped by external influences. The most decisive event in this process was the exile to Babylon around the 6th century BC. There, in contact with Persian religiosity, especially Zoroastrianism, the Israelites encountered a concept hitherto absent from their tradition: the existence of an autonomous force of evil, constantly fighting against the principle of good. This new perspective presented a polarized universe where Ahura Mazda, the god of light and goodness, fought a cosmic battle against Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction and darkness. The influence of this philosophy was significant. Little by little, the texts produced after this period began to reflect a symbolic reorganization. Characters who had previously been secondary began to occupy the center of spiritual discussions. Among them, Satan began to be reinterpreted. From a heavenly figure who only accused and tested, he became a hostile presence, a direct adversary of the divine will. In the same context, the concept of the devil was also redefined. Whereas these entities had previously appeared as messengers of God's justice, from the post-exilic period onwards, they came to be described as evil forces acting in defiance of the higher authority. The Book of Enoch illustrates this transition well. Considered apocryphal but widely disseminated among Jews in the Hellenistic period, the text recounts the fall of angels who rebelled against God. These beings were punished and associated with eternal punishment, consolidating a belief structure in which evil gained personality and purpose. The acceptance of this new way of thinking, however, was not universal. For centuries, different understandings of the role of these spiritual entities coexisted. Groups such as the Sadducees completely rejected the existence of demons and angels, focusing only on the law and worship. The Pharisees, on the other hand, accepted the active presence of these beings in the conduct of human life. This division reflects the internal diversity of Israeli thought in transition. The consolidation of evil as a force antagonistic to divinity paved the way for future religions. Both Christianity and Islam inherited this dualistic view, incorporating the figure of Satan as a direct and active opponent of God. Over the centuries, the concept evolved, but its roots are embedded in this moment of transformation in Israelite thought, when the ancient tension between order and chaos was gradually replaced by a moral dispute between good and evil. This process of assimilation did not take place in a vacuum. The Israelites were engaged in constant cultural exchange. Mesopotamia, in particular, offered a rich imagination, with beings that moved between the world of the living and the dead. Among the most feared were the Utukku, who haunted the living, and the Gala, who were responsible for dragging souls to the lower regions. Pazuzu, the most famous of these spirits, was invoked both to ward off disease and to cause calamities. It is at this point that we see how geographically distant ideas found an echo among the Israelites. Although they did not adopt these beings in their entirety, there are echoes of these beliefs in later texts. What was once just noise in the desert now had a face, a name, and a function, and the invisible world gained a new prominence in the spiritual realm. In ancient Egypt, the invisible world was inhabited by entities that challenged the boundaries between man, animal, and deity. Among these creatures were guardians of the afterlife, beings who protected or punished souls that crossed the gates of the underworld. One of the most feared was Ammit, a fusion of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, whose role was to devour the hearts of the damned. This grotesque figure was not just a symbolic punishment, but the personification of spiritual failure. For the Egyptians, judgment after death was an inevitable step, and many feared not passing it with dignity. Beyond the realms of the afterlife, the Egyptians also recognized the presence of spiritual beings that wandered among the living. Restless spirits, if not properly honored, could cause illness, bad luck, and imbalance. It was necessary to appease them with offerings and specific rituals. This perception that invisible forces could inhabit abandoned places and bring misfortune was not unique to Egypt. It also found echoes among the Israelites, albeit in a less elaborate form. Even with a different doctrine regarding the afterlife, the Israelites preserved the belief that arid regions, caves, and deserts were home to dangerous entities. The absence of detail did not mean an absence of belief, but rather a more subtle and symbolic way of dealing with the unknown. Over time, this view would undergo profound changes. Contact with the Persians represented a watershed moment in this process. The official religion of the Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism, did not see evil as an extension of the divine, but as an opposing force, commanded by an autonomous entity, Angra Mainyu. This being waged an eternal war against Ahura Mazda, the principle of good, in a relentless cosmic battle. This concept deeply influenced Israeli thought, especially after the return from the Babylonian exile. Exposure to this dualistic theology brought about significant changes. Until then, destructive spirits, when mentioned, were seen as instruments of God himself. After living with Persian ideas, reports began to emerge in which such forces acted on their own, with objectives contrary to the divine order. Evil, previously understood as part of a greater balance, came to be treated as something separate with its own intentions. This new view gained strength, especially in writings that circulated outside the traditional canon, such as the Book of Enoch. There, the so-called fallen angels play a central role. They are described as heavenly beings who transgressed the established limits, revealed secrets forbidden to humans, and were therefore severely punished. This story marked a decisive moment in the transformation of Israeli spirituality. Evil ceased to be merely a manifestation of divine justice and became a rival power in itself. But this change was not uniform. Different groups within Israeli society reacted in different ways to these external influences. The Sadducees, for example, denied any involvement of angels or demons in human daily life. For them, the relationship with God was based solely on the law and the temple. The Pharisees and Essenes, on the other hand, were more open to complex spiritual visions and naturally absorbed the ideas of intermediate beings, some oriented toward light, others toward darkness. Israeli thought, therefore, did not follow a single path. It was woven by many hands, spanning centuries and absorbing elements from neighboring cultures. What began as a diffuse conception of forces associated with judgment and order gradually became a system in which evil took on a face, a purpose, and an opposition. This construction can be seen in the very layers of the sacred texts. The books that now make up the Hebrew Bible were not produced sequentially or with a unified doctrine. Each passage reflects a moment, a theological vision, a response to specific historical and social events. For this reason, the approach to the supernatural varies greatly from one book to another, In some, there is almost complete silence about the spiritual world. In others, it takes on definite contours and a decisive role. A classic example is found in the Book of Job. The character Satan appears there not as a rebel, but as a member of the divine council. He acts as a kind of prosecutor, raising doubts about Job's faithfulness. His actions are not contrary to God's will, but arise with direct authorization. This shows that at that time, the idea of an adversary as an absolute enemy did not yet exist. Evil continued to be a means used by God himself to fulfill certain purposes. Another revealing case occurs in the first book of Samuel. A disturbing spirit sent by God torments King Saul, causing him emotional instability. This passage confirms that destructive forces, far from being autonomous, were part of the divine logic of punishment and correction. There was still no mention of demons as we know them today. Everything was interpreted within the domain and sovereignty of the Creator. Over time, the language of the texts changed. During and after the Babylonian exile, descriptions emerged of beings that no longer acted solely with divine permission, but seemed to have their own goals, contrary to the established order. In the Book of Enoch, for example, fallen angels corrupt humanity by teaching forbidden practices such as witchcraft and metalworking. This breakdown of hierarchy represented a new way of understanding evil as something that destabilizes the divine plan. The figure of Azazel is a reflection of this period of transition. In Leviticus, a goat is sent into the desert as part of an expiatory ritual. The animal symbolically carries the transgressions of the community, and its destination is Azazel. In the original text, it is unclear whether Azazel is a place, an entity, or a representation of separation from God. Only in later writings is he treated as a demonic spirit, reinforcing the tendency to personalize evil. The Shedim also appear, mentioned in Deuteronomy, as recipients of forbidden sacrifices. Although their origin is unclear, scholars point to connections with lesser deities from the Mesopotamian world. Their presence shows how external elements were adapted and reinterpreted according to the spiritual needs of the Israelite people. To fully understand these transformations, it is necessary to consider the context in which each text was written. Ideas did not emerge ready-made. They matured as the people faced wars, exile, foreign influences, and internal disputes. And with that, the figure of demons, previously non-existent or symbolic, became a central piece in many later views of evil. Among the peoples of the Near East, the boundaries between the sacred and the occult were difficult to define. Enchantments, ritual formulas, and esoteric practices circulated naturally among ancient societies, often without being seen as anything out of the ordinary. In the Israelite universe, this boundary was even more delicate. Magic was not entirely banned, nor was it completely accepted. It occupied a space of tension, regulated by those who held religious power in each era. In Hebrew texts, the condemnation of witchcraft is forceful, especially in the Book of Deuteronomy. Those practices considered unrelated to official worship were described as abominations. Expressions such as, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," demonstrate the fear that certain groups had of any ritual that fell outside the purview of the priesthood. However, upon closer inspection, we see that some forms of divination were not only tolerated, but were part of the official structure of worship. Such is the case with the Urim and Thummim, two objects used by priests to consult the divine will. Although they involved an oracular process, these instruments were considered legitimate precisely because they were under the control of temple representatives. What was condemned, therefore, was not necessarily the use of the invisible, but the attempt to access it without institutional authorization. This ambiguity also appears in the episode of the Medium of Endor. Saul, faced with divine silence, seeks a necromancer to obtain answers. And what happens is surprising. Samuel's spirit actually manifests itself. The question that hangs in the air is inevitable. Was the practice really effective? Or does the text merely symbolize the king's despair? Whatever the interpretation, the account shows that even kings themselves did not hesitate to resort to what was forbidden when conventional means failed. In addition to written accounts, material evidence also tells a silent story. Excavations have revealed objects with protective inscriptions, amulets with ancient formulas, and small silver scrolls with hidden blessings. All of this suggests that, despite formal prohibitions, magical practices were intertwined with popular religiosity. The key, in the end, lay in the context. Who performed the ritual? For what purpose? What is defined today as magic may have been at that time just another way to touch the invisible, as long as it was the right way.